Chapter 6.
The account of our second Christmas in Kenya includes a highly oblique reference to LegCo, the Legislative Council, which was to play such a large part in all our futures. But at this time we were preoccupied with other things. Monique had become engaged to a young Swiss man and was shortly to leave us. The cattle were still suffering from intermittent bouts of sickness, and we had no confidence in our vet. And of course we were anxious to do our best at the shows. We travelled 140 miles up country to the Eldoret show, where we met Nellie Grant, the mother of Elspeth Huxley, the authoress, for the first time, and 100 miles down to Nairobi for the East Africa Kennel Club show.
31st of December 1950. Christmas Eve was exceptionally warm and oppressive. A few of the senior boys from the farm wandered up for their presents, gaily coloured pullovers done up in Christmas paper and labelled with a Swahili greeting, "From the Bwana and Memsab." We went up to Kabazi for a mixed gathering of the staffs of Rhodora and Kabazi, with their children and a few friends of Vi and Freddie. Tea was laid on trestle tables with benches on the terraced lawn under a large thorn tree. Chocolate cakes and strawberries and cream provided the highlights of the feast, and Vi poured about 60 cups of tea from the large silver urns we had lent her. When tea was over, and balloons and paper blowers had provided sufficient amusement, games were organised, and David was introduced to Nuts in May. The game was enthusiastically led by Freddie's burly, rather dour Scottish head market gardener. Suddenly we heard hooting, and Father Christmas drove up in a huge car. Gasps of dismay from Pam and John, who had spent the entire morning decorating a jeep with white sheeting, Christmas trees, cotton wool snow, and silver bells. However, as Father Christmas on other days is a busy legislative councillor known as the Honourable Michael Blundell, he no doubt failed to see it because he was thinking of high politics. The children surged up the steps onto the top terrace and into the house after Father Christmas. The tree was in the dining room, and he distributed the presents there. He was very genial, but failed to modify his voice, so that his 4-year-old daughter announced loudly, "That's Daddy!" Towards the end of the party, a series of Vi's washtubs were pushed down a long steep bank with excited children inside, as good as any Cresta run. David loved that, and many people remarked on his pluck. 7th of January 1951. We have been saving an amusing incident which happened on a hot, sultry afternoon before Christmas. Lord Waterpark visited us with his attractive French fiancée and 2 other beauties, a blonde and a brunette. These last 2 announced that they had come to buy for their hostess, a Mrs. Newell in Sabukia Valley, a Christmas present, an in-calf Guernsey heifer. Rosemary and I looked at each other, swallowed hard, and said that we had really no heifers for sale, but, as this was such a special request, would they like to stay for tea? For by the time it was over, the senior grade heifers would be up at the cowshed for the evening checking and feeding. This they accepted with alacrity. Lord Waterpark and his fiancée disappeared in their car to Bruce Mackenzie's farm nearby, where they were going to deliver a miniature tractor for Bruce's son and heir. Lord W. was a pupil there for over a year before moving to his own farm. Rosemary took the 2 lovelies round the pigs, which seemed to interest them a lot, to her surprise, and after a tour of the cowsheds they returned to tea. The brunette was doing up her face at the dressing table when Rosemary came into the bedroom to see if they had everything they wanted, and she was asked, "Is this a photograph of your mother?" "Yes," said Rosemary. "Why?" "Well," said the brunette, "I was at Exbury in August playing in a tennis tournament with your brother Eddie as my partner. I'd been brought over by Edward Montague." This decided Rosemary to let them have one of her precious heifers, so after tea we went to see the animals. Their requirements were for one with a sweet face, large eyelashes and soft eyes. and we managed to find one answering to all this, but which also had a black nose, so we should have culled it sooner or later anyway. It must be admitted, however, that she was in calf to the butterfat baby, so we should normally have waited until after she had calved before selling her. When the party had left, we looked up Leo's letter of last August describing the tennis tournament. Here is an extract. Edward's girlfriend, who was partnered with Eddie, was so glamorous that I am surprised Eddie had time to look at the ball. She wore a pink, very open-necked shirt and the shortest green shorts I have ever seen. Next day, they all turned up dressed like land girls in the back of Lord Waterpark's new lorry and very professionally loaded up the heifer, which we had bathed and clipped for them. The loading was accompanied by many sweetie pies, darlings, and treasures, alluding to the heifer, not me. They drove away with much hand-waving, and we heard later that the Christmas presentation was a great success. The animal was handed over to her new owner with a wreath of flowers round her neck and a large satin bow. How they got her to walk respectably, I do not know, as she had never been led in her life, and had certainly never had anything to do with anyone more glamorous than the wizened old man who herds the great heifers all day in the crater. 14th of January, 1951. Sunday was almost entirely occupied with Tip's Joan of Flemish Farm, the heifer which is seriously ill. John the vet called in the morning and decided to get a second opinion from Brian Sheriff, his senior partner. At 7 on Monday morning, John called, and Rosemary and I went up to the cowshed to wait the arrival of Brian Sheriff. Brian is a much more decisive and energetic character than John, with more experience. He quickly decided that the heifer had acute peritonitis and pneumonia. He told us to take the heifer out from the new buildings, up a paddock, to the old wooden buildings which have an earth floor. There we were to build a ramp so that her forelegs would be at least a foot higher than her rear legs, and she was not to be allowed to lie down for a week to 10 days. We had to treat a cow like this at Elliott's, and we saved it. He prescribed digitalis for her heart, 2 quarts of liquid paraffin and eggs, brandy and milk every 4 hours, all to be poured into her down a rubber tube, for she would not take anything but a little water herself. The heifer was too weak to take a single step of her own volition, so we all had to push and heave. Eventually we hitched her to the back of John's Land Rover and drew her forward step by step. In the middle of the paddock she had to cross, she collapsed. We agreed, feeling the breakneck speed of her pulse, that she would die if we took her a step further, so we got her up and put her forelegs on a hillock. Then we brought bales of hay and built a windbreak around her. She stayed there all night with a guard and the flickering light of a hurricane lamp. The next day we built a canvas roof over her against the sun. She seemed to maintain her strength through the day, and at about tea time Ace asked Rosemary for permission to move the heifer on a stretcher up to the proper ramp at the top of the paddock. Accordingly, after milking, a padded gate was brought, and with all hands the heifer was slowly lifted onto it. At the moment of lifting, a tremendous gust of wind enveloped them all in a dust storm, so that they could hardly see what they were doing. When the dust cleared, they saw that Tip's Joan had quietly died. Her heart had given way. It was dusk, and Ace went off to fetch John to do a post-mortem. Meanwhile we got the lorry out and moved Tip's Joan to a corner of the coffee chamber. When John arrived, it was quite dark, and we operated in the lights of his car. We found a small piece of wire in the second stomach, but the real trouble was acute inflammation in the fourth stomach. This has been sent down to the vet lab. We are all very sad, for the heifer put up a game fight for 5 days, for her life. I examined the 3-month-old fetus at the post-mortem. It was a heifer. 28th of January, 1951. David understands everything you say to him in French, but he will not utter. On the other hand, he is also learning Swahili fast, and in this language he sometimes comes out with some surprising remarks. Last week we went through the archway into the pedigree yard, and Anifer, a greyed cow, was waiting for her pedigree bull foster child. Rosemary pulled David away and hid behind the gates, explaining to David that this was a very bad-tempered cow. "Indio," said David, nodding his head until it nearly fell off. "Kali kabisa." Yes, completely fierce. It was the perfect expression, intoned exactly as the Africans would have done. His progress in Swahili comes from his watering of the garden. In this he has long sessions with Manasseh, our charming garden boy, and he simply loves it. He has learned to turn taps on and off, and Rosemary finds him rearranging the position of her garden swizzler, while up at the cowshed it is not uncommon to find that the water bowls suddenly do not fill nowadays. Anything to do with water fascinates him. 4th of February 1951. On Thursday we went to Nairobi, taking the aces with us. Our first stop was Army Disposals, where we found a mixed crowd of rapacious-looking Indians and tough-looking Africans waiting at the gates to claim as much as they could of the 1 3/4 million shirts and shorts and so on which the Army was selling off cheap. We inspected the samples of the garments, joined the queue, and bought 4 bales of shirts, long trousers and shorts, 100 in each bale, made of good khaki drill and working out at an average of about 3 shillings per garment. We left Ace to pay the cheque and went on to the vet lab next door to see Dr. Sherlaw, the scientist who is tackling the Rhodora plague. From the calf we took down there last week, he has isolated a bug which he showed us under the microscope, but he refused to commit himself as to whether this was the source of the trouble and said he wanted more cases. We said, "Heaven forbid!" but he said if the bug was to blame, he knew how to cure it. The little calf itself is doing well, and he is giving it B-Max to eat in case the problem is vitamin B deficiency. 11th of February 1951. On Monday, a niece of the headmistress of Rosemary's Day School in London arrived with her husband, brother, and sister-in-law. To her astonishment, Rosemary recognised her quite easily, although it was 24 years since they had last met. We took them down to see the crater, a never-failing source of entertainment for visitors, and when they saw the so-called swamp, which is now nearly all cleared ready for ploughing, they said they would try to see if there was any water there, as 2 of them are water diviners. Sure enough, they could find water all over the place, though they could not tell in what quantity or at what depth. I asked them if they would show me how to do it, and I think that the stick reacted with me as much as with them, and in the same spots. It would not react for Rosemary. On Tuesday, by a strange coincidence, a little man turned up whom Rosemary described as an Adonis from the hydrographic department of the government. He took scientific tests down in the same area and reported that our chances of getting a borehole anywhere on this farm were remote, owing to the volcanic nature of the ground, which contains immense fissures on and below the surface. However, he did think that it would be worth digging a well in the swamp, although he said that if after 120 feet we had not struck water, it would not be worth going on. He blazed a tree at the best point to start digging. Now we have to find someone who will take on the job. Our Adonis showed no enthusiasm for water diviners. On Friday, Dr. Sherlaw turned up. We nearly expired with delight when he said he had come for 10 days, if necessary, to study on the spot the peculiar calf disease we have here. He is staying in a hotel in Nakuru, and we think he has in tow a rather nice-looking, middle-aged widow whom he brought here yesterday afternoon. This may account for his prolonged visit, as she also has to be in Nakuru for 10 days. Our office looks like a laboratory, with microscopes and slides and strangely coloured fluids. We collect the most revolting samples for him, and he spends many happy hours looking at them. He thinks he is on the track of something, but will not commit himself yet. 11th of March 1951. I went to the vet lab in Nairobi on Monday morning. I was warmly greeted by Dr. Sherlaw, who had the usual microscope, retorts, Bunsen burner and other paraphernalia around him, and a number of boxes. As I came in, he was waving a slide about. He explained to me, indicating an open box, that one of his colleagues was ill and he was trying to discover what type of amoebic dysentery he was suffering from. Then, indicating an identical box, he offered me a stick of Edinburgh Rock. I accepted in order not to appear fussy. An angular girl in trousers came to the door and was sent off to prepare the 2 calves which Rosemary had left there the week before for their journey. Dr. Sherlaw and I strolled down to the paddock, and the calves were safely installed in the Ford Pilot, in the place where the back seat should have been, with Brown Eyes, the second head Lumbwa, sitting on the floor beside them. When Dr. Sherlaw heard that I was going to call at Nakuru on the way back, his face lit up, and he asked me if I would take a parcel to the hotel for his lady friend, Mrs. Green, who is still sorting out the accounts there. We went back into his laboratory, and he produced a new box of Edinburgh Rock out of the cupboard where he keeps all his specimens. Wrapping it up in an atrocious piece of brown paper, he handed it to me. I carried it safely back to Mrs. Green in Nakuru, and she seemed delighted to receive it.
We had decided to sell a couple of heifers to a Mrs. Daly, who arrived late one night after an overland journey of 750 miles from her farm in Tanganyika.
I got up at dawn and went out to make sure that the heifers which we had put aside for Mrs. Daly to choose from were looking their best. And after breakfast, while Rosemary took her up to see them, Captain Webb and I went down to the veterinary officer in Nakuru for a permit to move the cattle. Captain Webb is 65 and is the vet Mrs. Daly had brought with her. We were confronted by a straight-laced junior who told us there could be no variation from the rule, which we did not know about, that the animals could not be moved without agreement from the authorities in Tanganyika. This would take at least 3 days to obtain. Mrs. Daly is the sort of person who is not pleased if she does not get her own way, and Captain Webb, who is terrified of her, warned me that she would go up in smoke. Back at the house, I confronted her. She was irate and announced that she was prepared to forge a letter from the Tanganyika authorities. I began to realize what a difficult woman I was dealing with. She is about 42, powerfully built, with an immensely strong character. She is Irish, with an accent and a loud voice. She was for many years master of the Galway Blazers, one of the most famous packs of Irish foxhounds. She has had 3 husbands, and the latest is a charming and very correct man who has been in the Blues and was a previous master of the Galway Blazers. I said that I would not be a party to any forgery, since the good name of this farm, vis-à-vis the Tanganyikan veterinary authorities, was more important than the deal we were doing with her. She threatened to take the cattle away without a permit, and I said that I would not help her to load or provide fodder or condone her action in any way. Finally, she threatened to go without the cattle. At one stage, I went down to a solicitor in Nakuru for advice. But in the end we triumphed, and she agreed to give in and wait for the permit to come through. I was very pleased, for we sold her 6 in-calf grade heifers for £75 each, which is a very good price for grades, and this represented possibly the first export for Guernseys from Kenya to Tanganyika. In the evening she borrowed our car and driver and went off to Nakuru. She came back feeling better, for she had found a friend who was going to phone the Tanganyika veterinary authorities at Mpwapwa to hurry things on. While all this hullabaloo was going on, Rosemary was still coping with the builders, with Mrs. Daly's equipment which she had turned out from the lorry and which lay strewn all up the garden path, and with General Hawkins, who arrived by appointment at 10 a.m., picking his way over the litter to select some animals which we had offered him for sale. He was very methodical, critical and businesslike, and having pretended he knew nothing about Guernseys, he picked the 6 best and earmarked 4 more. 25th of March, 1951. On Friday, Lady Claude Hamilton prinked onto the lawn. She had come to lunch, but her husband had boils, so he was left behind. After refusing potatoes, we presume on account of her figure, she managed to consume 2 large helpings of strawberry fool, so the lunch at least was a success. We talked a bit about our Lord Claude, David's godfather. She told us that when she first married her Lord Claude, the other Lady Claude was not too pleased because she kept receiving my bills and I got all her party invitations. After she left, we decided that she only came to see one thing, our bulls. She wanted to form an opinion about whether her Shorthorn or our newly imported Guernsey bull would win Supreme Champion at the show in October. After showing her the bulls, we tried to interest her in the other stock, but she could not contain her impatience and unaccountably had another engagement, to which she rushed off.
Returning from a stay in England.
17th of June, 1951. We had a good journey to Rome, where we were amused to see a letter on the notice board at the airport addressed to Roland Williams, whose plane from Tokyo was due in the next evening. We scribbled something to him on the back of the envelope. Lydda was reached late in the evening, and we climbed into the booked sleeper which had been prepared, but Rosemary was suffocated and could not breathe. So she sat in a chair most of the night, while I dozed fitfully. On the whole, we think it better not to have a bunk. It is too hot and stuffy. After breakfast in the morning, Rosemary went forward with the captain to look out for Rhodora. We landed only 20 minutes late, and as we stepped out onto Nairobi Airport into soft sunshine and exotic flower-scented air, we took a deep breath and said, "Oh, how lovely to be back in Africa." Customs caused us no trouble at all. Although air freight was closed because it was Sunday, by asking our Indian friends in the ordinary customs section to help us out, we were able to clear the 4 suitcases which we had sent by passengers' luggage in advance. Both cars were waiting, with the lorry driver and the chauffeur, now well after the dreadful burns he received when the electric light engine caught fire just before I left, grinning from ear to ear and coming forward to shake hands with a cordial "Jambo!" Soon we were flashing along the main tarmac road to Nakuru, the country looking beautiful and green, so that it was a joy to get to the top of that escarpment about 3/4 of an hour outside Nairobi, where you have a view that seems to extend half across Africa. We turned into Rhodora at 12:30 p.m. our time, and what a change greeted us. The house, now painted white with black roof and paintwork, is flanked by the office block and implement sheds and garages, all painted the same. Grass such as we have never seen waves emerald green and lush all around, and everything sparkles and smells warm and fresh. The rest of the week has been spent quietly getting on top of everything again in the office. One morning, David, Rosemary and I drove down Sace Avenue to the crater. Here some 5 acres have been fenced and cultivated. The land lies in a natural basin surrounded by cliffs, and a large gang was there that morning planting lucerne. Within a few years we hope to have paddocks all the way down to this area. The earth is nothing but topsoil, rich and black, and should grow anything one wants. Many of the boys have come from their various farm jobs to greet us and ask news of England, but the second headman really excelled himself, for after shaking me earnestly by the hand he said, "Thank you for coming back to us." I felt somewhat overwhelmed, and wondered vaguely if he was about to ask for a rise, and where he thought we would go to if we had not come back to Rhodora. I presented Kipsang, the head herd boy, with a 30-shilling Ingersoll watch from England. He is immensely pleased. The next day, Beatrice and David, on their usual morning safari round the farm, met him at the dip. He came forward and asked, "What time is it?" "About 9:30, said Beatrice, puzzled. Kipsang, with a flourish, produced a large flannel rag, unwound his watch out of it, and told her that the correct time was 9:35. 1st of July, 1951. Rosemary went up to a farm in Sabukia, miles past the wards, to a dispersal sale. She went to see a young Rhodora bull resold. Ace also went in his little van with Mrs. Ace and their daughter Linda to buy a fridge. The auctioneer was not Charles Long, but a rival firm. He excelled himself by merely saying of the bull, I have seen Mrs. Sayes this morning, and she tells me that she hopes the bull's dam will do better this lactation." Effectively damned, the bull sold for a song, 110 guineas. Then a man came up to Rosemary and asked, "Are you Mrs. Sayes? I have been wanting to meet you for some time, and I hope to come and see your Guernseys." "Yes," says Rosemary meekly. Then, turning to Ace, who was sitting next to her, he said, "And are you Sayes? I am so glad to meet you." Rosemary must have looked stunned, because Ace came to the rescue with a quick reply. "No, I am the stockman who looks after Mr. and Mrs. Sayes's animals." John Robertson, the vet, has not been a success out here, either with our Beatrice or with his clients. Rosemary and Sheila Reynard took a sick dog belonging to John and Pam to him, and after examining the dog, he asked his classic question, "And what do you think is wrong?" Sheila suggested M&B, and he of course agreed. The latest story about his skill is that he went to a neighbouring farm to do a caesarean on a cow, and as he was cutting her open, the farmer remarked that he thought he had cut her intestine. However, the vet proceeded with the operation, and after a long search announced that he could not find the calf, so he sewed the poor cow up again. Shortly afterwards the animal calved naturally, and 2 days later died of peritonitis. John Robertson is said to have told a friend that he had never actually done a caesarean before, but he had seen it done. Now there is one more farm added to a long list, which he won't be asked to visit again. Brian Sheriff, his partner, is a very different person, brisk and efficient. We have already taken the hay in the craterland. Now we are cutting a lot on our pastures, using one of George Manuel's machines to do the cutting, while we do the raking and baling. We had no idea that grass could grow the way it does on our farm, and we are cashing in on it, especially in view of the locust threat, by taking every bit of hay we can. Working 2 teams, we go on from dawn until dusk. Our crops of oats and maize are also infinitely better than we have seen before. This is partly due to the better rains, and partly to the extra fertilizer we put on. It is really thrilling to go round the farm and see these crops, and makes us realize that we have a farm with first-quality land. We killed a pig and gave George a leg. He killed a sheep and gave us some mutton in exchange. I am finishing the typing of this late on Sunday evening by lamplight in the office, while Rosemary is starting her bath. During a pause from the sound of the typewriter, I heard a sound which is familiar just now, the talk of the huge flocks of geese which pass overhead at night. In the moonlight, one can see them, high in the sky, in perfect formation. 15th of July, 1951. Having watched the seed planting on the farm, and having assisted at the planting of his own garden, David is beginning to grasp the principles of crop growing. One night this week, as he was being put to bed, Rosemary remarked how tall he was becoming, and she said that he would be as tall as Daddy. "And then, are you going to have a moustache like Daddy?" she asked. "No," said David. After questioning, he pointed, giggling, to his upper lip and said, "No seeds to grow." 22nd of July 1951. I asked a disgruntled gentleman named Maloney to come to tea with his wife to discuss the appalling fact that the Guernsey Society has increased its annual subscription from 20 shillings to 40 shillings. This move had already provoked Mr. Maloney into a series of letters and arguments that owners of only a grade bull should not be subject to the increase. Tea time arrived, and with it Mr. and Mrs. Maloney, but by some unfortunate mistake we had put it down on the wrong day. So Rosemary started off well by asking him who they were and what they wanted. After an extremely sticky tea, we migrated with our visitors to the cowshed, where they melted and became quite human and discussed each animal intelligently and knowledgeably. We are always amused at the variety of things, good and bad, which impress different people who visit Rhodora. Mr. Maloney's deepest impression was when he gasped to his wife as he walked down the rows of greyed cows being milked, "Not one of these animals' legs are tied. Think of that! Not one!" Typical old Kenya settlers milk their greyed cows in tumble-down shacks and usually tie their legs because they are so wild, never being handled except at milking time. Maloney nervously picked his way across the dispersal yard through the quiet cattle and was amazed that many of them took no notice of him at all, even continuing to lie down chewing the cud. We patted them and pushed them aside to make room for him to get across to the heifer pens. They left us at dusk, full of enthusiasm, and no more mention for the time being of increased subscriptions. 29th of July 1951. I was busy typing in the office when up drove a car, and out of it stepped Freddie Ward, unexpectedly, with Mr. and Mrs. Cavendish Bentinck. He is known throughout the colony as C.B. and is the Member for Agriculture, the equivalent of Minister of Agriculture in England. He recently married an attractive lady of strong character who is half his age. We set off for the farm buildings with them, and Rosemary followed soon after. We saw the pedigree females grazing in a paddock alongside the sheds, and I found John Clark and Kipsang to bring out the bulls. Tudor Ace was on his way to Nakuru with a load of cattle for sale. I sent John to lead out Malverley Beauty's Triumph, the 18th-month-old bull, while the party was looking at another bull. Hearing an ominous noise, I rushed around to his pen, and when I looked over the door of the box, I saw John taking refuge on top of the ironwork of his yoke. I called Kipsang, and we got hold of the bull's ring and tried to get his head up. Unfortunately, before we had achieved this, the door of the box flew open, and he charged out into the yard, with all three of us hanging onto his ring with one finger. He pinned John to the wall, with Kipsang and me on the edge of his horns. A desperate struggle ensued, but we could not get his head up, and poor John was as white as a sheet. The door of the yard was of course closed, and C.B. looked silently on while Freddie, Mrs. C.B. and Rosemary leant over the wall shouting advice. We did not know what to do next, for we did not dare let go of the ring. Having been waltzed around a bit and being very frightened, we made the only possible plan, and all suddenly let go at the same moment and made a mad rush to leap over the wall. This manoeuvre was successfully accomplished, and the only reminder of the incident was John's badly bruised and grazed rib. It was not until we had collected our wits again that we noticed a little heifer, due to go to the sale, which Tudor Ace had washed and put to dry off in a pen next to the bullpen. Unfortunately, Malverley's Beauty's Triumph happens to have a habit of seeing red whenever one of his prospective wives are nearby.